There are stories where the internet watches from a distance. And then there are stories where the internet slowly starts believing it has ownership over another human being's life. That is what happened with Timmy Whittaker. By the time Eric Carroll finally broke his silence, the public conversation had already hardened into two competing narratives. One side believed Eric genuinely cared about the Whittaker family and became emotionally attached after seeing how vulnerable they were. The other side believed Eric crossed the line, inserted himself too deeply into a fragile household, and started imagining a role in Timmy's life that was never his to claim. And sitting at the center of that argument was one question that refused to dissipate. Why did Eric believe he could become Timmy's guardian? Or as critics framed it even more bluntly, why did Eric think he could adopt Timmy away from the Whittaker family? That question matters because it cuts directly into the emotional core of this entire story. Not the money, not the channels, not the investigations, not even the internet drama. The real emotional center of the Whittaker controversy was always dependency. Who depended on who? Who cared for who? Who believed they were protecting vulnerable people? And who ultimately had the right to decide where vulnerable adults belonged? When Eric returned online after months of silence, he immediately sounded exhausted. Not angry at first, not defensive in the loud internet sense. Exhausted. He described weeks of answering messages, sorting through emails, reviewing questions people had sent for months while he stayed quiet. According to Eric, nearly 200 questions had piled up from viewers wanting answers about Timmy, Lorraine, Ray, APS, the removals, and what really happened behind the scenes in West Virginia. And almost immediately, Eric said something revealing. "I don't want to talk about this every day anymore." That sentence matters because it suggests someone who feels consumed by the situation rather than empowered by it. But critics heard something completely different. They heard someone trying to regain control of a story after losing public trust. And that divide is important because nearly every sentence Eric spoke was interpreted through two completely different lenses depending on who was listening. Some viewers heard grief. Others heard manipulation. Some heard emotional attachment. Others heard obsession. That tension sits underneath everything Eric says in this update. Because one of the biggest revelations was not about APS paperwork or legal processes. It was about how personally Eric still viewed his connection to Timmy. When questions came in asking whether he planned to regain visitation or continue involvement with the family, Eric answered emotionally. He said his relationship with Timmy should never have been taken away. That line changed everything. Because to supporters, it sounded like heartbreak. To critics, it sounded alarming. The criticism came fast and brutally direct. People began asking, "What relationship? You knew this family for only months. You are not blood. You are not lifelong caretakers. You are not Timmy's parent." And that is where this story becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because Timmy Whittaker was not a child legally speaking, but emotionally, psychologically, and cognitively. Many viewers perceive him as deeply dependent and vulnerable in ways similar to a child. That changes how audiences interpret attachment. If a fully independent adult befriends someone new, nobody panics. But when the person involved struggles with communication, understanding, vulnerability, and dependence, public sensitivity becomes much sharper. Suddenly, every interaction is examined differently. Every trip, every outing, every private moment, every emotional claim. And Eric seemed unable or unwilling to fully understand why people reacted so strongly to his statements about Timmy. That disconnect became especially visible when he once again brought out the guardianship and conservatorship paperwork. To Eric, the paperwork proved something important. He believed it proved APS trusted him. He believed it proved he was not secretly plotting to control the family because, according to him, legal responsibility was offered and he hesitated instead of immediately accepting it. But critics saw the paperwork very differently. They did not see proof of innocence. They saw proof that boundaries had already become dangerously blurred. Because the public question was never only, did Eric legally pursue guardianship? The deeper question was, why did the situation evolve to a point where a man who met the family months earlier was even discussing legal responsibility over profoundly vulnerable adults? That is the emotional fracture at the center of this entire controversy. Eric frames the guardianship discussion as reluctant responsibility. Critics frame it as inappropriate emotional overreach. And neither side fully accepts the other's interpretation. During the live stream, Eric repeatedly referenced his own past custody experiences and family struggles. That detail matters psychologically because it helps explain why he may have emotionally connected to the Whittakers so intensely. People who have experienced legal or family trauma themselves sometimes become highly reactive to situations involving vulnerability, caregiving, separation, or state intervention. And Eric seemed to frame himself partly through that lens. Not as someone chasing control, but as someone who believed he understood what it meant to fight for people. The problem is that emotional identification can sometimes distort judgment, especially when vulnerable adults are involved. Critics argue that Eric stopped seeing the Whittakers as a family needing professional boundaries and started seeing them as people he personally needed to rescue. That distinction matters enormously, because rescue psychology often feels compassionate to the person performing it while simultaneously becoming destabilizing to the people receiving it. And the Whittaker situation was already unstable long before Eric arrived. Poverty, isolation, medical vulnerability, family dependency, internet exposure, public humiliation, donation controversies, drug allegations surrounding extended relatives, adult protective services involvement. All of those pressures already existed or were developing before Eric became heavily involved. Then suddenly another emotionally invested outsider entered the structure. And according to critics, everything escalated afterward. One of the most controversial moments in Eric's return involved FaceTime contact. Eric implied he had still been communicating with Timmy for a period after the removals. To Eric, this demonstrated emotional continuity, proof that the bond was real. But critics heard something entirely different. They heard a man continuing emotional involvement with someone removed into state protection after a highly controversial public collapse. And once again, the same question emerged. Was Eric helping Timmy emotionally? Or was Eric emotionally dependent on the role Timmy gave him online? That question remains unresolved because emotional dependency does not always look selfish on the surface. Sometimes it looks compassionate. Sometimes it looks protective. Sometimes the person themselves genuinely believes they are helping. That is why the Whittaker story became so psychologically complicated. Almost everyone involved seemed to believe they were helping in some way. Mark believed exposure brought awareness. Patrick believed experiences brought happiness. Eric believed intervention brought protection. Viewers believed donations brought support. APS believed removal brought safety. But despite all those people trying to help, the final outcome was devastatingly fragmented. Timmy separated. Lorraine separated. Ray removed. Betty isolated. Larry condemned publicly. And millions of viewers still arguing over who actually protected anyone at all. By the end of Eric's stream, another detail became impossible to ignore. He still spoke about the Whittakers emotionally in the present tense. Not as a closed chapter, not as an old internet controversy, but as an unresolved emotional wound. And that may explain why the criticism surrounding him became so intense. Because the internet can tolerate creators documenting vulnerable people. It can even tolerate controversial involvement for a while. But the moment audiences believe someone emotionally crossed from documenting vulnerability into psychologically attaching themselves to it, the public mood changes instantly. That is where Eric Carroll now exists in the Whittaker story. Not fully villainized by everyone. Not fully defended either. But trapped in a strange space between caretaker, outsider, advocate, participant, and controversial emotional figure. And according to Eric himself, that unresolved attachment is exactly why he could never simply walk away from Timmy Whittaker completely. Comment below whether you believe Eric genuinely cared about Timmy as family, or whether emotional boundaries became dangerously blurred long before the public realized it. The deeper Eric Carroll spoke about Timmy Whittaker, the clearer one uncomfortable reality became. This was never just a story about internet content anymore. It had become a story about emotional possession. Not legal possession, not ownership in the literal sense, but emotional possession. The feeling that someone vulnerable had become central to another person's identity, purpose, or emotional world. And once that happens publicly, audiences begin asking questions that are much harder to answer than simple accusations of fraud or exploitation. Because money leaves records. Intentions do not. One of the biggest moments in Eric's return came when he described the guardianship paperwork again in greater detail. He held the documents up almost like evidence. Not evidence against the Whittakers. Evidence against the narrative surrounding him. According to Eric, APS workers sat across from him in Beckley, West Virginia, and presented him with instructions, evaluations, conservatorship information, financial paperwork, and legal pathways connected to the future care of vulnerable adults inside the Whittaker family. And Eric's argument remained consistent. If he truly wanted control, if he truly entered the family with manipulative intentions, this was the opportunity. This was the legal opening. This was a moment where the state itself was effectively saying, if you want responsibility, here is the process. But according to Eric, he hesitated. He says he immediately thought about Betty. He thought about how long she had cared for the family. He thought about his own wife, children, and responsibilities back in Georgia. He says he never went to West Virginia looking to become someone's guardian. And psychologically, that distinction matters because Eric consistently frames himself as someone pulled deeper into the situation by circumstances rather than someone intentionally inserting himself into it from the beginning. But critics continue pointing to something else. Not what Eric refused, what Eric considered. Because to many viewers, the emotional concern was never simply, did Eric officially gain guardianship? The concern was, how did emotional involvement escalate to a point where guardianship even became psychologically imaginable? That is the part Eric still seems unable to fully grasp. The public discomfort was not only about paperwork. It was about proximity, intensity, attachment, frequency of involvement, and the increasingly blurred line between advocacy and emotional emotion. The criticism intensified further when Eric spoke about wanting continued contact with Timmy. That detail deeply unsettled many viewers because the removals fundamentally changed the legal and ethical structure surrounding the Whittakers. Once APS intervened and vulnerable adults entered state protection, many people expected all emotionally entangled outsiders to step back completely. Eric did not seem emotionally capable of doing that. And that is where the controversy became psychologically explosive. Because there is a massive difference between, I hope they are okay, and my relationship with them should never have been taken away. The second statement implies emotional entitlement to continued closeness. That is what alarmed critics, especially because Timmy's cognitive vulnerability changes how audiences interpret consent, attachment, and emotional dependency. Eric often spoke about Timmy with genuine affection. That part appears authentic to many viewers. But authenticity alone does not resolve ethical complexity. Someone can genuinely care about another person while still crossing boundaries they do not fully understand. And that possibility sits over this entire story like a shadow. Throughout the live stream, Eric repeatedly positioned himself as someone unfairly turned into a villain. He argued that people online simplified an extremely complicated situation into a clean narrative with obvious heroes and villains because emotionally simple stories are easier for audiences to process. And to a degree, he is probably correct about that. Internet audiences prefer certainty, especially in emotionally charged situations involving vulnerable people. They want clear moral architecture: good people, bad people, protectors, exploiters. But the Whittaker situation never fit neatly into those categories. That is why the public conversation became so volatile, because nearly every major figure involved appeared morally mixed. Mark brought attention and resources, but also exposure. Patrick appeared to create joy and experiences, but became surrounded by financial controversy. Eric appeared emotionally invested and protective, but increasingly blurred emotional boundaries. Betty appeared loving, but also overwhelmed and inconsistent. Larry appeared passive, exhausted, and unable to maintain authority inside the home. And the Whittakers themselves became trapped at the center of a system larger than any of them fully understood. That moral ambiguity is exactly what keeps this story alive, because audiences are still trying to decide not only what happened, but how to interpret motives. And motives are much harder to prove than actions. One of the most revealing moments came when Eric seemed frustrated that people questioned why he cared so deeply. To him, caring felt self-evident. He spent time there. He drove across states. He dealt with courts. He interacted with APS. He helped with resources. He witnessed conditions firsthand. From Eric's perspective, emotional attachment became inevitable. But critics argue that emotional inevitability is exactly why strict boundaries matter around profoundly vulnerable adults, especially when cameras, internet audiences, and public identity become involved. Because once emotional closeness becomes tied to public storytelling, motivations become difficult to separate cleanly. Was the connection private, public, protective, personal, content-driven, trauma-driven, identity-driven? Even Eric himself sometimes seems uncertain where those lines ended. And the internet noticed that uncertainty immediately. Another detail that intensified criticism involved Eric's tendency to frame himself emotionally alongside the family's suffering. He frequently referenced how hard the situation had been for him personally, how much stress he endured, how painful the public backlash became, how emotionally devastating it felt losing contact. And while those feelings may be genuine, critics believed something important was missing: perspective. Because no matter how emotionally invested Eric became, he still retained something the Whittakers did not: the ability to leave. That difference matters profoundly. Eric could return to Georgia, back to his wife, back to his children, back to his own identity outside the controversy. Timmy could not return to a normal independent life because Timmy never possessed one to begin with. Lorraine could not simply emotionally detach from state intervention. Ray could not process public narratives online. The Whittakers remained structurally trapped inside the consequences long after content creators could step away. And some critics believe Eric never fully understood that imbalance. That criticism became especially intense when he discussed what life might have looked like if guardianship had moved forward differently. Even when Eric frames those moments hypothetically, audiences react strongly because it touches a profound ethical nerve. The idea of a man relocating a cognitively vulnerable adult he met months earlier into a completely different life structure feels deeply unsettling to many viewers, even if Eric believed his intentions were compassionate. That discomfort reveals something important about public psychology. People are often more suspicious of emotional rescue narratives than financial narratives. Money exploitation is easy to conceptualize. Emotional dependency is harder, because emotional dependency can feel loving while still becoming destabilizing. And many viewers believe that is exactly what happened here. Not necessarily calculated manipulation, but escalating emotional entanglement inside an already fragile system. By the second half of Eric's return, another pattern became visible. He repeatedly framed himself as one of the few people who truly saw the Whittakers as human beings rather than internet spectacle. That belief likely sits at the center of his self-understanding in this story. He appears to genuinely believe he loved them in a way the internet failed to understand. But critics argue something equally uncomfortable, that believing yourself uniquely compassionate can sometimes justify crossing boundaries other people instinctively recognize as dangerous, especially when vulnerable people begin emotionally relying on you too quickly. That is why this controversy remains unresolved emotionally even now. Because there is no clean conclusion. No courtroom-style ending where one revelation suddenly explains everything. Instead, there are overlapping truths existing simultaneously. Eric may have genuinely cared. Eric may also have become emotionally over-involved. APS may have trusted him in certain moments. APS involvement may also have accelerated family collapse. The Whittakers may have benefited from outside attention. That same attention may also have destroyed the structure holding the family together. And perhaps the most tragic part is this. Everyone involved seems to believe they were trying to help at some point. But intention alone was never enough to stop the damage once the internet fully entered the Whittaker home. By the end of the live stream, Eric still sounded emotionally tethered to the family. Not strategically, not financially, emotionally. And whether viewers interpret that as compassion or obsession largely determines how they interpret everything else he says. Because the real divide in this story is no longer about whether Eric was present. Everyone agrees he was. The divide is about whether his presence became something healing, or something the family was never emotionally equipped to survive. Comment below whether you believe Eric's attachment to Timmy came from genuine compassion, or whether emotional involvement crossed a line that should never have been crossed with a vulnerable family already under enormous pressure. What makes the Eric Carroll story so difficult to resolve is that almost every version of it contains at least some emotional truth. That is why the internet still cannot let it go. If the story was simple, people would have moved on already. But instead, audiences remain divided because they are reacting to two different fears at the same time. One fear is exploitation. The other is abandonment. And the Whittaker family somehow became trapped directly between them. Eric's supporters look at the situation and see a man who entered a collapsing environment and tried to help people nobody else was consistently helping. They see someone who drove across states, dealt with courts, interacted with APS, brought resources, spent time with vulnerable people, and emotionally connected with a family most of society ignored for decades. To them, Eric's attachment feels understandable, maybe imperfect, maybe messy, but human. Critics see something else entirely. They see a vulnerable family already struggling with poverty, dependency, isolation, and public exposure suddenly becoming emotionally absorbed into another outsider's personal mission. And they believe that once emotional rescue became mixed with internet visibility, the boundaries protecting the Whittakers began collapsing faster than anyone realized. That is the fracture this story never escaped. Was Eric stepping into a void of neglect, or stepping too deeply into lives that were never his to emotionally reorganize? Even now, Eric still appears to believe the public fundamentally misunderstood his intentions. He repeatedly frames himself as someone punished for caring too much. Someone who became emotionally invested in people he believed were being failed by everyone around them. And maybe part of that is true. But there is another reality that keeps surfacing no matter how much explanation follows. Once vulnerable people become emotionally dependent on outsiders moving through unstable systems, outcomes become unpredictable very quickly, especially when multiple outsiders arrive at once. Mark. Patrick, Eric, viewers, donors, APS, police, content creators. Suddenly, the Whittaker household was no longer just a family home in rural West Virginia. It became a contested emotional space filled with competing ideas about protection. And once that happened, the family's ability to control its own future weakened dramatically. That may be the deepest tragedy in the entire story. Not that people cared, but that too many people cared in conflicting ways without clear boundaries, unified structure, or professional stability strong enough to hold everything together. Eric still seems haunted by the idea that he lost access to Timmy unfairly. That emotional thread runs through nearly everything he says. He talks about silence, about accusations, about not being able to defend himself, about wanting people to understand context. But underneath all of that sits something much simpler. Grief. Not necessarily romanticized grief, not performative grief, but the grief of someone who emotionally attached themselves to a vulnerable person and then suddenly lost access to them. And regardless of whether viewers believe that attachment was appropriate, the emotional pain itself appears genuine. That sincerity is what makes the public reaction so unstable, because audiences are usually comfortable condemning obvious villains. Eric does not present as an obvious villain to many viewers. He presents as someone who may have genuinely cared while simultaneously becoming part of a system that still ended disastrously. That ambiguity unsettles people more than certainty would. By the end of his return online, one thing became increasingly clear. Eric does not believe he destroyed the Whittaker family. He believes he tried to save parts of it. But critics ask a brutal question in response. If everyone trying to help leaves the family more fractured than before, what does help even mean anymore? That question reaches beyond Eric himself. It reaches into the entire ecosystem surrounding vulnerable internet subjects. Because the Whittaker story exposed something much larger than one controversy. It exposed how quickly emotionally vulnerable people can become public emotional property once millions begin watching. Audiences formed attachments. Creators formed attachments. Helpers formed attachments. And eventually the actual family became buried underneath layers of competing emotional investment from strangers. That is why this story still feels unresolved. Not because people lack information, but because information alone cannot untangle emotional responsibility. Who crossed the line first? Who genuinely helped? Who unintentionally harmed? Who believed they were protecting people while actually destabilizing them further? Those questions remain painfully open, and maybe they always will. Because the final truth about the Whittaker family may be that nobody involved fully understood the emotional consequences of what was happening until it was already too late. Now the house is quieter. The porch videos are gone. Timmy is no longer publicly visible. Lorraine disappeared from the internet. Ray vanished into state protection. Betty remains separated from the life she spent decades maintaining. Larry became a symbol of exhaustion and collapse. Patrick remains surrounded by controversy. And Eric Carroll still sits online trying to explain why the public story never felt complete to him. But perhaps the most revealing part of all this is that even after investigations, accusations, removals, and public backlash, the internet still argues less about money than emotion. Because deep down, people instinctively understand that this story was never only about fraud allegations or donations. It was about vulnerable human beings becoming emotionally entangled with outsiders in ways nobody knew how to control. And once those emotional lines blurred, everything else followed behind them. The APS paperwork, the court orders, the public accusations, the removals, the silence, the grief. The internet keeps searching for a single villain because single villains make stories easier to survive emotionally. But the Whittaker story may be something more disturbing than that. a situation where multiple people probably believed they were helping while participating in a process none of them were truly equipped to manage safely. And that possibility is much harder to sit with than simple blame. Comment below whether you think Eric Carroll became unfairly villainized for trying to help, or whether emotional involvement with the Whittaker family crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed once vulnerable adults became central to the story.